Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. You've found your way to Part 3 of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson. So, if you haven't heard Parts 1 and 2 yet, go back and listen to them, and then rejoin us. I'll save you a seat. Today, instead of doing what I often do, and rewinding the story a couple minutes so you can settle back in, I'm going to try just giving you a quick recap up front, and then jumping right back into where we were. So now, please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies. It Was a Face Out of Hell. The shooting of Patrolman Masterson. Part 3 starts now. Here's the story so far. A stick-up in a New York City speakeasy on West 103rd Street results in the death of Patrolman James Masterson. The four gunmen escape, but the police are soon hot on the trail of the murderers of their slain buddy. The stick-up occurred on the night of January 31st, 1927, and within 24 hours, detectives Martin and Donahue have lines out for four suspicious characters. Whitey Murray and his pal Ula Taylor, suspected as the actual murderers, Mrs. Grace Peterson, well-to-do young Forest Hills matron, who the detectives surmise was innocently used by the gunman for alibi purposes, and Linehan, proprietor of an uptown club acquainted with the gunman. A soiled handkerchief discovered by the sleuths in Taylor and Murray's rooms becomes the first tangible clue. Wednesday, February 2nd, Detective Martin hastens to headquarters to be present at the questioning of Linehan, the nightclub proprietor. Linehan was seated in the anteroom outside the chief's office when Martin arrived. His nerves appeared to be badly shot, and judging by his appearance, Martin guessed that he'd had not a wink of sleep since he'd seen him the night before. He had bungled himself into a bad mess the previous day because of the clumsy way in which he'd lied. Martin was inclined to believe he'd had no hand in the fatal stick-up that had done in poor Masterson, and like many another, Linehan thought he was protecting his interests by not reporting the stick-up in his own club the preceding Sunday, even though he knew the leader of the gang which had perpetrated it. Whitey, the gang leader, it was true, had never threatened Linehan with death if he squealed. Nevertheless, had he quietly communicated with the police, they would have trapped the man, and Masterson would have been going on his rounds that morning instead of lying on a slab in the morgue. Consequently, Martin didn't feel much sympathy for the club owner's blue funk, and hoped that the chief would sweat him good and hard, and that he would be present to see him do it. But this hope was promptly squashed when Martin was summoned to the chief's desk soon after his arrival. "Detective Waldman called me up about 15 minutes ago," Chief Carey told Martin, shooting straight at the matter at hand, as was his custom. "Mrs. Peterson and 5 companions drove up to her home on Nansen Street at 4 o'clock Tuesday morning, shortly after the murder of Masterson. Her guests were 4 men and a girl. Around 5:30, 2 men and the girl left. It was too dark to get a good description of their faces. Then, yesterday evening about 7 o'clock, Mrs. Peterson drove off with 2 men who fit the descriptions of Murray and Taylor. She returned alone." The chief paused, picked up a small manila envelope, and opened it. "Yeah, Winkleman telephoned me this morning at 6:30, said Martin, "but we were cut off in the middle of the conversation." "Yeah, he told me that," Chief Carey said. Then without any further explanation, he went on. "The men out at Forest Hills have a perfect plan, and we'll learn far more by keeping close tabs on Mrs. Peterson than if we attempted to question her and show our hand. Now, here's the handkerchief you picked up yesterday at the Covent Avenue apartment of Murray and Taylor. The laundry mark was put there by Sanitary Hand Laundry of 145 West 116th Street, proprietors an N. Barash. That's quite a distance from the Covent Avenue address. See what you can pick up there." It took Martin less than half an hour to reach the uptown address. He found Sanitary Hand Laundry to be an up-to-date establishment not far from 7th Avenue. Before entering and questioning the manager, Detective Martin learned that he had an excellent reputation, and Martin would be quite safe in disclosing the object of his visit to him when the time came. Prior to visiting the laundry, Martin had canvassed the neighborhood around the gunman's apartment to learn as much as he could about the 2 men. The main points he picked up were these. 2 young men, one known as Tippy Murray and one as Pete Sellier, had engaged a furnished room in the neighborhood on August 15, 1926. They informed the landlady that they worked in the New York post office. They explained their irregular hours by saying they'd worked on alternate night and day shifts. Had she inquired at the post office, as the police did, she would have learned this was a falsehood, but she never dreamed of questioning the word of her quiet, well-dressed, polite star lodgers. The laundry company had called and delivered laundry to them every week. Then, on November 15th, they'd vanished, leaving no forwarding address. Both the laundry manager and the landlady identified identification photograph 31010 as that of the man who gave his name as Murray, but they could not identify any one of the 3 photographs which had been picked up out of the gallery as possibly belonging to Murray's gang. Sellier's description, however, tallied closely with that of the man known at the Covent Avenue apartment house as Taylor. All morning and afternoon, Martin combed the neighborhood looking for his young cousin, Pete Sellier, who had lived there until shortly before the previous Thanksgiving. It was around 4 o'clock when he found his first definite lead, in a beauty parlor. There he learned that a female instructor in a dance hall on West 125th Street, named Trixie, had been going with a sheik named Sellier. He had, however, quote, given her the air, unquote, and she had confided the story of her broken romance to her manicurist. Sellier's heartless jilting had not broken the dancer's ambitions, whatever it did to her heart, for she had been graduated a short time later, this according to the dance hall proprietor, and gone to work at a well-known nightclub. This flashy cabaret did not open until 10:30 p.m., so Martin returned to headquarters to lay the items he'd picked up during the day at the chief's desk. He had before him scraps of information gathered by all the detectives working the case, and by attempting to fit them together, he often was able to make order out of what looked like chaos. In this manner, he had picked up the name of Pete Sellier and bracketed it with the owner of a telephone number which Peter Taylor had called once or twice from the Convent Avenue apartment. The Sellier family lived in the Bronx and was composed of a widow and 2 sons. The younger son, Pete, was a white-haired boy. His mother and brother had slaved to give him a splendid education, according to the reports of detectives who had been making inquiries throughout the neighborhood. In his own neighborhood, Taylor bore no excellent reputation, and was regarded as a ne'er-do-well who was ashamed of his humble relatives. That tied Pete Sellier and Peter Taylor together, so the police knew that they were the same person. Men were dispatched at once to keep the Sellier home under surveillance. Posing as 2 butter and egg men, Donahue and Martin visited the nightclub at 10:30, only to learn that the girl they sought had resigned the week before and was supposed to be working in a black and tan cabaret in Harlem. For a little while, the 2 officers chatted with the hard-eyed young hostess who gave them this information, and they soon came to the conclusion that Trixie DeFore had not made the splash she expected when she invaded Broadway. She had not, however, they discovered upon entering the gaudily decorated inn on Upper 7th Avenue, fallen to the low level of the black and tans. Here it was suggested by a genial head hostess that our young cousin might be working in a certain cabaret on one of the side streets. The name of that cabaret will not be mentioned here to avoid giving that disreputable resort any publicity. We'll just say that it was located on the first floor of one of the brownstone fronts, a typical 4th-rate place with all the bad features of a nightclub, exhibited at their worst. The police put on the act of being surprised and delighted in recognizing Trixie, a girl they'd danced with in the 125th Street dance hall, and she received them as such. Partners to those dance hall hostesses are pretty much anonymous unless they prove to be exceptionally generous and present them with a sheaf of checks for each dance. Then they are well-remembered suckers and pounced upon every time they appear on the scene. When Trixie did her turn, Martin and Donahue were not surprised that Broadway had given her the hook. She was pretty enough in a flamboyant sort of way, bushy black hair and bold dark eyes. But she went like wildfire with the 4th-rate club audience, who encored again and again the following ditty parodied from a Broadway revue, which she sang in a loud, gritty voice. It goes like this, though I don't know the tune. Ma peddles snow around him. Dad makes synthetic gin. I sell love for a livin', and gosh, how the dough rolls in. Very well pleased with her success, Trixie returned to Martin and Donahue's table and set herself out to be entertaining. Her idea of this task apparently was to make pointless jokes which she herself laughed and giggled at continuously. Now there's no better place for extracting information secretly than a cabaret. As the disconnected conversation drifts hither and yon, precious bits of information may be gathered without the subject being aware of the fact that he or she has answered any direct questions. So it was that evening. If she'd thought about the matter at all, Trixie would have been convinced that it was she herself who brought Peter Sellier and Mrs. Grace Peterson into the desultory chatter. A high-hatted femme was the way Trixie described the young matron of Forest Hills. Not the sugar mama type either. Pete was always a good picker, though he wasn't much of a spender. He was a sweet boy, though. I saw him and his friend with another Sheba at the club where I worked, but Pete ain't stuck on Mrs. Peterson, really. He met her when he was a kid at some place in the Adirondacks where she has a swell spot. The police let this precious tip float a while in order not to disclose undue interest in Mrs. Peterson. But they managed to find out that though Trixie had heard the name of the place in the Adirondacks where Pete had vacationed, she didn't remember it. Pete, she thought, was going to college. What was more important to her was that he was a swell dancer. "A place in the Adirondacks," Donahue repeated after they left the cabaret and faced a biting, drizzle-dampened wind that tore through the narrow street. "We ought to find out where that is easy enough. Might be right up near the border. I don't believe it's much use trying the ticket offices, for all the agents ever seem to see is hands through their windows." Donahue was right. He and Martin made careful inquiries, but brought down nothing. Though Mrs. Peterson was the subject of considerable gossip in the community, none of the neighbors knew much about her private affairs. She belonged to none of the country clubs and never appeared at the bridge parties, which are usually hotbeds of information. However, one of the detectives had found out that Mr. Peterson was a horse trainer and was at Miami, Florida for the winter. He'd left home shortly after Thanksgiving and was not expected back until spring. And, just as Trixie had been carefully led to discuss Pete Sellier and Mrs. Grace Peterson, so someone well up in Peterson's affairs down in Florida found himself mentioning the Peterson Lodge in Old Forge, New York. So now Martin and Donahue had the address of the camp, but as of yet no certain knowledge that the fugitives were there. Late on Wednesday night, a car tore up to the front gate of the Peterson home in Forest Hills and carried off the lady of the house. To have sent anyone prowling around the Adirondack camp at that time would have risked ruining the police's chances of surprising the men if they were there, as law enforcement guessed they were. But they knew that the slightest breath of suspicion would send them flying off before the police could possibly arrive. Besides that, the police didn't want to travel all the way to the Adirondacks on a wild goose chase without having definite proof that someone was occupying the cabin. And it seemed less pressing because many other leads cropped up that appeared to be just as important as the one pointing toward Mrs. Peterson. On Thursday, February 3rd, 1927, Patrolman Masterson was buried. The services were held at St. Thomas's Church and were attended by all the department officials, headed by Police Commissioner McLaughlin. After paying their last respects at Masterson's funeral, Martin and Donahue resumed the trail of his murderers, but it was not until Saturday afternoon that they got a definite lead. This came from the men at Forest Hills, who telephoned that a servant from the Peterson home had been followed to an outlying post office where she'd approached the parcel post window. She did not notice the pleasant-faced young man who stood by her elbow and read the address on the package she held. The address was, "To Mrs. Grace Peterson, Camp Utica, West Shore Road, Old Forge, New York." He heard her explain to the clerk that the parcel contained a fur coat. That was enough. Donahue and Martin, accompanied by Detective Brady and Teed from the 24th and 30th squads, left on the midnight train that night and arrived in Thendara, the first station on the Manhattan side of Old Forge, around noon the following day, which was Sunday. This momentous shifting of scenery signaled the final stirring act of the exciting manhunt. The temperature was many degrees below zero, but it was a dry cold, and the snow-covered country looked magnificently beautiful that Sunday when Martin and Donahue arrived in the mountains. It was just 6 days after Masterson's murder. They found a comfortable small hotel for their headquarters and then considered the problem of how to find state troopers to assist them without letting the community know who they were or what their mission was. There were no telephone booths in the hotel. It was the dead season, the only guests at the time being permanent boarders who were employed in the offices of a large timber concern. Later on, Martin found the proprietor, Harold Van Auken, to be a swell fellow, and he was favorably impressed with them from the start. But too much was at stake to trust snap judgments. As is always the case in such communities, there would be, they knew, much speculation as to their identity. As a sop to the curiosity of the local inhabitants, Martin and Donahue gave out that they were there to shoot bear. So, immediately after midday dinner, they went for a stroll, scouting around for a place to telephone from. They decided that the best thing to do was to appeal to the postmaster of the village whom, through the window of the small little general store, they saw sorting mail. They let him assume that they were federal agents, and he willingly enough went out and closed the door, leaving them in possession of the telephone. Martin immediately telephoned the state troopers in Herkimer, and the commander promised to send 2 of his men, Corporal George Whitber and George Coburn, right over to the hotel. Now, when they arrived at 3 o'clock, the 4 New York City policemen and the troopers made quite a little party. Though the troopers were in plain clothes, they looked as if they meant business, and scarcely carried out the fiction that they were sportsmen with the sole purpose of hunting bear. Martin and Donahue knew that Whitey and Taylor, or to give them their other names, Tip Murray and Pete Sellier, were vicious, dangerous men. To attempt to arrest them in the open meant that they would surely shoot it out, and in the battle some innocent bystander might be killed. There was only one hope of capturing them without endangering any other lives, and that was to crash their retreat. That afternoon, Martin and Donahue and the two state troopers drove over to Old Forge and made inquiries of an official about the occupants of Camp Utica, which was the name of the Peterson camp. That official told them that a woman and two men were living there. As cautiously as possible, Martin, Donahue, and the troopers surveyed the lodge. It was a comfortable one-story building. It appeared to have a living room, kitchen, bathroom, and 3 bedrooms. To make sure, absolutely sure of the arrangement of these rooms, they were obliged to consult again the official mentioned before. Photographing the camp and its surroundings firmly in their minds, Martin, Donahue, and the troopers drove back to the inn for a consultation on the best way to break into the premises. They finally decided that the troopers should guard the outside to prevent anyone from escaping. One was to station himself on the rear northeast corner where he could observe the north and east sides. The other was to take the opposite corner where he could observe the south and west. They were ordered to shoot if anyone tried to get away. Now they needed an automobile to drive them there. They couldn't use the same one they'd used that afternoon, as the driver was a talkative fellow who might put 2 and 2 together and wonder aloud to his friends about what, quote, them city slickers, unquote, were after. In scouting around, they came across an old Ford coupe and a driver who seemed to fit the bill. Martin and Donahue ordered him to pick them all up at the inn at 5 o'clock in the morning the following day. Martin and Donahue had been strenuously pounding the pavement. Add to that all the strong cold air, and they were desperately sleepy. After going over every move they intended to make, it was nearly midnight. "We want to be sure to break in just after daylight," Martin said to the other fellas. "And if that Ford chauffeur doesn't turn up, well, we'll have to hoof it the 2 miles over the snow. So I'm going to go downstairs and put in a call for 5 sharp." The steps were thickly carpeted, and Martin heard a low murmur of voices ascending from the office. He was surprised by this because in that part of the country, folks were usually abed and asleep by 9 o'clock unless an exciting game of pinochle was going on. Around the great log-burning fireplace, he saw a group of guests surrounding the proprietor, all engaged in what appeared to be a very engrossing conversation. As he approached nearer, Martin saw the proprietor's wife and mother were also in the gravely concerned little crowd. Suddenly, everyone turned and looked in Martin's direction, and the conversation ceased abruptly. It took no detective training to enable him to figure out that he and his companions were the subject of what they had been discussing. "What are you all sitting around here for at this time of night?" Martin asked Van Auken. The proprietor answered with a twinkle in his eye, while the others regarded him with uncertain, embarrassed smiles. "We're not going to bed until we know what you fellas are up to," said Van Auken. Martin took him aside and told him that they were on a mission connected with the New York City Police Department, but that he couldn't go into any more detail. Van Auken could explain to his family and his guests that they'd find out what it was all about the next day. While talking to Van Auken, Martin grinned at their natural curiosity, and they looked a bit sheepish. He couldn't tell them everything yet because the news that they had come to pick up a couple of murderers with orders to bring them back dead or alive would have kept them awake for the whole night. "What I came down here for," Martin said aloud, "is to ask you if you'd have your clerk call us at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning." "The clerk that'll call you," the proprietor laughed, "will have to be an alarm clock. That's what the bear hunters use." All right, the next phase of this story is the actual confrontation between law enforcement and the murderers. And if you want to hear what happens, then you'll have to join me again this Sunday for Part 4, the thrilling conclusion of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson. Now, before I let you go, there's something I wanted to talk about for a moment, so please do hang around if you would. I'd appreciate it. First off, I wanted to send love to listener Ryan Downer, who reached out to me yesterday because on Tuesday at his workplace someone took their own life. Apparently there's a bridge over the parking lot behind where Ryan works, and tragically someone jumped off it and died. And Ryan didn't see it happen, but he did see the aftermath, the police, the body, and that is a traumatic thing to witness and something that's difficult to process. So, Ryan, my heart, and I imagine the hearts of the entire Kinda Murdery community go out to you. That's a really tough thing to go through. I'm so sorry. And I'd also like to mention to everyone to make sure that you all know about 988, the free 3-digit lifeline number that you can call anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Please do program it into your phone right now. 988. You can call 988 anytime to receive immediate counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So if you find yourself in crisis, please do call 988. And please do remember that the world is a better place with you in it, and you are loved. And if you're going through something difficult, like Ryan did, please do feel free to reach out to me. I can be contacted at kindamurdery on all social media. You can email kindamurdery@gmail.com, or you can call the Kinda Murdery line, 888-MURDERY. That's 888-687-3379, and share with me what's on your mind. You can also reach out or call the Kinda Murdery line to share your own Kinda Murdery story and maybe inspire an episode of the show. Now, I'm probably not the one to reach out to if you're in really dire straits because I'm not a professional and I don't want to act like I am, but if you're going through something tough or you just like to connect with someone, you absolutely can reach out to me. I'm here, I care, and I would love to connect with you. Again, sending love to Ryan Downer, and everyone, please do come back this Sunday, June 11th, for Part 4, the thrilling conclusion of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson. Until then, I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.